Okay, here we are back from our break, and I have a picture here. We talked about the building boom, that we had churches being built everywhere and castles being built everywhere, and here is a picture of this building going on, which I thought you could see how medieval people would build. You can see some we can see some things we're used to here, some tools that are still used in modern times, like the bricklayers' tools. The pulley here to raise them up. Okay, let me leave that on for a minute because we were having a little discussion during the break that I thought we'd share with our off-campus people, and I'm sure that a lot of you are finding the names overwhelming here with this genealogy that I've given you of the kings and queens of Jerusalem. And one of the things we have to remember, I mean, I don't want you to try to memorize all of these names and dates. What I want you to understand is how things worked. Okay, we've got a power struggle going on. The kingdom of Jerusalem is founded. There are three factions that are struggling for power. What are those three factions? Yeah.
The king, the barons, and the church between the prelate, the patriarch, and the prelate.
Yeah, well, the patriarch is claiming that he is the overlord and he is above the king. Okay, we went through that with Damebert, and then periodically it's revived so that some of the other patriarchs also say, well, I'm the king. in essence, you know, I'm above the king. And then the king, of course, is asserting his power, or trying to, and the High Court of Barons is asserting its power to control even the king. Doesn't this kind of make you think of Magna Carta in England, where the barons say the king has to be under the law? This is what exactly is going on here, as you'll see later on when we see more of the story. Okay, now into this mixture of the power struggle comes this hereditary nature of the kingship, which the kings are claiming. They want to pass the kingship on to their relatives. Now, Baldwin Baldwin the First passed it on to his cousin, Baldwin the Second. He designated the next person who would be the king. But the barons then turned around and they elected Baldwin le Borg as king to be Baldwin the Second. Now, Baldwin the Second then picked he had two daughters, so he wanted to pick the daughter's husband. The daughter and her husband, that would be Melisande, and he picked her husband Fulk of Anjou, who was an important count in France, and they were joint rulers together. Okay, Fulk and Melisande then wanted to pick their son, who would be Baldwin the Third, to be king. So they're asserting the power of kingship, and Fulk and Melisande are very strong rulers. Okay, and then later on we have some weak rulers. The barons, in the end, the barons win. The High Court asserts its power and it's able to win, but they're all struggling for power. Now we have this genealogy showing all the marriages and the family ties, because that's part of the power struggle. It's the king asserting his inheritance and the right of the inheritance of his family. So that's part of the power struggle too. So what I want you to understand is how it all works together. And I may not get through everything tonight, and I hope I get through this story because it's really interesting. It's an interesting story, but if I don't get through it all, we'll just take it up when we come back again after the exam. And anything I don't say, of course, you're not responsible for. Well,
Dr. Vaughn?
Yes, question.
This is Gary. Are the notes for the lecture going to be posted on the website?
Yes, they're already posted on the website. So you can get the information on the website. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, now, going back to where we sort of ended up and telling the story of Fulk and Melisande. Melisande is dead, Fulk is dead, Baldwin III is ruling with Melisande. Okay, they made a deal. The king revolted and had himself crowned again, and alone this time. And then he sent all his friends to Melisande with an offer to divide the kingdom, and Baldwin would take essentially the northern part, and Melisande would rule Jerusalem in the south. And here is the division that Baldwin wanted to make. That didn't last very long. Melisande accepted. Manassas was deposed because Manassas was the one who was standing up for Melisande, and Baldwin III objected to him. Okay, so Melisande accepted the offer and got rid of Manassas, and then conferred the constableship on Humphrey, Lord of Toron. Queen Melisande was angered, and difficulties began. King Baldwin encroached on his mother's land, and soon there was open war between them. King Baldwin isolated Manassas in a castle of Maribel and attacked Neapolis or Nablus. Queen Melisande then fled to Jerusalem and was besieged in its citadel. Many of her vassals went over to the king, and only her son Amari, Lord of Jaffa, Philip of Neapolis, and Rohard, Vicomte of Jerusalem, remained. Fulcher the Patriarch intervened to try to avert the civil war, and he failed. King Baldwin then stormed the citadel, and Queen Melisande gave up Jerusalem and retired to Neapolis. Actually, Queen Melisande reminds me of Adela Abois. Doesn't she remind you of her? I mean, Baldwin had to rebel and pack his mother off to a nunnery, really, before he could get rid of her, because she was ruling with him. He wanted his own right to rule. Baldwin III then opened up wars against Nur-ad-Din and the Egyptians, and this was the most important thing that happened in the second part of Baldwin III's reign. In 1153, the Christians captured Ascalon, and the city was organized as a fief and given to Amari, the king's brother. In 1156 to 1160, there were wars against Nur-ad-Din around Damascus, Banaeus, and Shazar. Jerusalem was strengthened by an alliance with Byzantium, and Baldwin married Theodora, a niece of the Emperor Manuel Comnenus. And I have a picture of Manuel Comnenus here. This is a medal of Manuel Comnenus as the Byzantine emperor, and this shows a kind of portrait of him. Okay, in 10 February 1162, Baldwin III died at the age of 33, lamented by all. They really loved him as a king, but he had no children at this point, and so the kingship passed to his brother Amari, Count of Jaffa and Ascalon, and it wasn't an inheritance. Because there was no son, he was elected king. So here we have Baldwin III, and here is Amari, his brother, the kingship passing to Amari, his brother, and we'll get into his marriages here in a moment. Okay. Oh, and here's that medal again. Okay. Now, we're starting our next lecture. Okay, King Baldwin III died on 10 February 1162 in Beirut at age 33 and much lamented. The throne devolved by election to his brother Almeric, or Amari, Count of Jaffa and Ascalon. The barons disagreed about electing him king. He was married to Agnes de Courtenay, sister of Jocelyn III of Edessa and widow of Renaud of Maries, and she had been betrothed to Hugh de Ibelin of Ramah. Okay, and here is our genealogy again. Here is his marriage to Agnes de Courtenay, and she is the sister of Jocelyn III de Courtenay, Count of Edessa. Okay, as Amari was distantly related to her, and as he was considered to have stolen her, the clerics and the barons refused to make him king. So he divorced her, and she promptly married Hugh de Ibelin, and Amari was crowned king. The reign of Amari marks the zenith of the kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, you know, you all need to write, actually, on your genealogy that Agnes married Hugh de Ibelin, because the Ibelins are going to become very, very important in all the struggles. So you need to sort of write that in on your genealogies that you have there. Okay. The reign of Amaury marks the zenith of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, 1162 to 1174. He was one of the most gifted monarchs of the kingdom and was particularly a gifted legislator. He was credited with the founding of 2 sets of courts for maritime and commercial cases, the courts of the Chain and the Fond, and he wrote the Assize of Belfis, which regulated the service demanded from a knight. Now, this is a diagram that shows the way how the government of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was supposed to work in theory and actually worked in practice as well. Here we have the King of Jerusalem, and he answers to his tenants-in-chief, or he commands his tenants-in-chief, who would be his vassals, and then his chief officers are the seneschal, the constable, and the butler. And the bailey would be sort of a vice-regent of the King of Jerusalem, who might belong right here, perhaps. Okay. The tenants-in-chief command the rear vassals, and the constable commands the marshal, which would be like a general, and the constable commands all of the armies. And all of them answer to the high court, and all of them, in fact, are members of the high court. And so this is essentially a really model feudal government, I think. I just have to agree with Lamont when he calls it a model feudal government. This assize, there was an assize permitting a husband to kill his wife and her lover in cases of adultery. The assize sur la Lagis said that some vassals must do liege homage to the king. Now, how would that affect? We have the diagram here. The question of liege homage, how would that affect the governance of the realm? Anybody understand how that works? What is liege homage? Does anybody know? Okay, you don't remember. No, homage is a reciprocal relationship. Okay, a vassal always does homage to his lord. But what if a lord has a vassal here, and that vassal has vassals of his own, but, okay, he has vassals of his own, but this vassal is a vassal of both this vassal and this lord. Okay. Okay. Now, if the lord, well, let's take this vassal. Let's say there's another lord over here, and this vassal is also a vassal of this lord. What if this lord and this lord go to war? Who does this vassal fight for?
He has to fight for the king, because he has to give liege homage to the king, like
Good.
Supreme homage.
Okay, liege homage is like supreme homage. So that if the king here, as the Lord, passes this law, that all sub-vassals, and that would include this vassal and this vassal being sub-vassals, that all sub-vassals have to do liege homage to the king. If the king goes to war with this vassal, which he probably wouldn't, but just say he would, then this vassal doesn't have to make any choice. He fights for the Lord. He doesn't fight for this vassal. Okay, these are rear vassals. If these two lords go to war, and he has already sworn liege homage to the king, then he fights for the king. Okay, liege homage is homage to the highest lord. Liege sort of means highest homage to the highest lord, and that's what it is. So the sub-vassals must do liege homage to the king. This would weaken the high court. This would weaken the council of barons, because all the vassals have to do liege homage to the king. And so this strengthens the king. The effects were that undermined the local power of major vassals, so that it was a centralizing move that would centralize and focus everyone's homage to the king itself. The tenants-in-chief were already liege vassals of the king, and this made all the holders of fiefs liegemen of the king and peers of each other. It brought all the fief holders under the king's high court and removed them from their suzerain's court. So let's go back to this little diagram I had for you before. Okay, in the old system, if this vassal had a case to take to court, he would take it to his lord's court, and this lord is a vassal of the king. Okay, now, under the new law, he would take it to the king's court, and this would make the king's court supreme over all of these sub-vassal courts. You see how this strengthens the king. This makes the king much more powerful. Remember, we're dealing with this power struggle here. Okay, any vassal deceased by his lord could now appeal to the king's court, and thus liege homage is reserved to the king. The king could then decease anyone who refused liege homage to him within a year and a day. Do you all know that feudal term, decease? Okay, it means that the king can take back all the fiefs. If you seize, when you give the fiefs to a vassal, you seize him. When you take them away, you decease him. Okay? All right. If there were a quarrel between the king and a tenant-in-chief, the vassal was to fight for the king to fight for the tenant-in-chief for 40 days, and then to switch to the side of the king. And what it did was make laws concerning how you do this. Okay? But laws are good. It means you're regularizing society. This assize, however, legalized revolt and strengthened the high court. At the time of its passage, it shows the strength of the king because he was able to push this through, but in later times it served to weaken the king and strengthen the barons on the high court. So at first, with a strong king, it asserts the king's power, but later it's going to weaken his power. Amari's repeated attempts to conquer Egypt were opposed by the Templars, but encouraged by the Hospitallers and Franco-Syrian nobility. Now here we're getting involvement because the military orders, who we'll talk about in detail later, but the military orders who started out as just small groups of monkish warriors now have grown very strong and powerful, and they're beginning to enter the power struggles in the government, switching their allegiance from one side to the other. Remember, I don't want you to remember all the names necessarily, but the system and how it worked. Okay, now we have more players in here, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Franco-Syrian nobility. The Byzantine alliance was cemented by his marriage to a Byzantine princess, Marie, and an alliance was concluded between Manuel Comnenus and Amari against Egypt. Okay, now we have Amari marrying again. He married first Agnes de Courtenay, and he's divorced her. Now he's marrying secondly Marie, and she is Marie of Byzantium. Okay. Question.
The Baldwin the Fourth here, which marriage does that come from?
Baldwin the Fourth comes from the marriage between Amari and Agnes de Courtenay. Okay. Now it's getting really complicated, right? Okay, the marriage that was annulled. All right. And here we have Manuel Comnenus again. I guess this is where I wanted to put this. Here we have the Byzantine emperor who is now getting involved again. Okay, and here is a seal of the commandery of the Templars. And here you see, this is interesting that on this seal you have two horsemen riding as a seal of the Templars becoming more powerful. But the dream of empire carried Amari away. He sacrificed to conquer Egypt, and he weakened Egypt while he weakened himself. And what happened was he ended up preparing the ground for Saladin, and this enabled Saladin to secure Egypt and surround him. His strength was proven by the successful, peaceful succession of his son Baldwin IV at his death. And the death of Amari marks the end of the era of conquest and strong kings and accomplishment. Elective monarchy was able to assert itself again, and the barons assert themselves as equals of the king. And so with the reign of Baldwin IV, now the monarchy becomes very weakened. The second period in the history of Jerusalem covers the loss of Jerusalem, the Third Crusade, from Baldwin IV to John of Brienne, 1174 to 1210. Okay, Baldwin IV was 13 years old when he became king, and he was a leper. He was crowned 4 days after his father's death, and before 13 years had passed, Saladin was to destroy the kingdom at the Battle of Hattin, and the city of Jerusalem was besieged. The boy was crowned in his own right, and there was no regent, but the government fell into the hands of the seneschal, Miles de Plancy, Lord of Montreal. He was unpopular for his arrogance, his domineering manner, and soon Raymond III, Lord of Tripoli, demanded the regency from the High Court. Who was the regent called again? What was his title of the regent? Bailey, right, Bailey, okay. I'm using the term regent here, but the term is Bailey. And I'll come back to that term again.
I thought those were different concepts. I thought a regent was responsible until the coming of age, and I thought that the Bailey was someone who stood in place while the king was absent.
Bailey is now broadened to serve. I mean, he serves as a regent. He serves as a regent, and he's called Bailey. And whether it's for a minor or the absence of the king. I wanted to show you this book that we read in the graduate seminar. It's a new book, The Leper King and His Heirs, Baldwin IV and the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. It's interesting because here's a picture of Baldwin, for one thing, killing an enemy, but also for, again, the thesis that Baldwin was a strong king. And we all agreed in the seminar that he really wasn't a strong king, that the author wanted to make him a strong king to argue against the weakening of kingship. You know, given what he was as a leper and being very sick and barely able to manage, he did an extraordinary job as king, and he was a strong person. But his illness, he died young. He only ruled for 13 years. He couldn't be a strong king because he was too sick. You know, I mean, I think he did remarkable things for his circumstances, but I don't think you can argue he's a strong king. But you can read the book and let me know if you agree or not. Anyway, it's a brand new book that's out. Well, soon Raymond III, Lord of Tripoli, demanded the regency from the High Court. Now, going again to our genealogy, Raymond III was the son of Hodierne and Raymond II, and Hodierne was a daughter of Baldwin II. So here, all these people are related. You see, it's very close-knit, all of these families. They're all related to each other. So he was a cousin. The High Court then awarded the regency to Raymond and control of the kingdom and custody of the king. Okay, here's our chart again. Miles, meanwhile, was murdered in the street of Acre, so things are getting violent. The time was one which required a strong man, and Baldwin tried really hard. Meanwhile, Saladin profited from the deaths of Nur-ad-Din and Amari and the succession of the children. In 1174, he had taken Damascus, Homs, and Hama, and Jerusalem was now encircled. The Count of Tripoli took the offensive, but arranged a peace in 1175. Then he violated it in 1176, attacking Damascus. Meanwhile, King Baldwin reached majority at the age of 15 in 1176, but was increasingly ill. In fact, from the time he was a child, his right arm was numb, and he had to learn to ride a horse without using his reins, and he had to learn to guide it simply by using his knees, which is kind of extraordinary. He was a remarkable horseman who rode into battle, in fact. Then Philip of Flanders arrived from the west with fresh reinforcements. And here we can see, I've sort of colored in here, the lands controlled by Saladin, and he has the kingdom of Jerusalem completely surrounded. He's made himself almost master of the situation, and it's pretty scary for the Crusaders. Here is Philip of Flanders arriving, hopefully to the rescue, but it doesn't work. Okay, Philip of Flanders brought a scheme to attack Egypt, and that collapsed, and Philip returned home with little action carried on. Baldwin, the king, was suspicious of Raymond of Tripoli, and the relations between them were cool. Baldwin then married his sister, Sybil, to Guy de Lusignan in 1180. Finally, in 1182, a truce was made between the king and Count Raymond. The years when Baldwin IV ruled alone were the constructive years of his reign. The new and successful methods of tax collection he instilled enhanced the kingdom. He also carried on the legislative tradition of his father, but in 1183 he went blind. Guy de Lusignan, Count of Jaffa and Ascalon, was appointed bailli, or regent. Baldwin retained, however, the royal title and the city of Jerusalem and 10,000 besants in revenue. Guy got management of the rest of the realm and swore not to seek the throne while Baldwin lived, and not to alienate any of the king's cities or castles. All the liegemen swore homage to him as bailli. Okay, now you see just this rising power of Guy de Lusignan, and on our chart, here he is. He's the second husband of Sybil. Okay, second husband of Sybil. And to answer your question here on Baldwin V, he is the son of Sybil and her first husband. Okay. The opposition to Guy centered around Raymond of Tripoli and the Ibelines. Raymond had gained the king's enmity by refusing to trade the city of Jerusalem for Tyre. The High Court resolved these enmities by crowning the 5-year-old Baldwin V king, and Baldwin V was, as we saw, the son of Sybil and William de Montferrat, her first husband. Okay. Guy was cut out of his hopes for succession. The deliberate assertion of the High Court of its right to elect the monarch, this is High, not Hugh Court, okay, this went against the tradition of the laws of inheritance. Well, I think calling it a tradition is premature at this case. What they're still doing is fighting out whether it's going to be a tradition or not. According to what had been done in the past, the mother should have been crowned, but now the High Court has gone around this and crowned the son instead. Okay, relations between Baldwin IV and Guy became steadily worse. Baldwin tried to have Guy's marriage to Sybil annulled and to seize Jaffa and Ascalon, and to ensure against Guy trying to rule for his stepson. The bailliage was given to Raymond of Tripoli with the city of Beirut to defray his expenses. But the High Court stipulated that in the case of the death of Baldwin V, Raymond's regency was to continue until his successor was chosen. And so here we have our chart again. Sorry to have so many here. The successor was to be chosen by an electoral college composed of the Pope, the German Emperor, and the kings of France and England. On 16 March 1185, Baldwin IV died, and Raymond made a 4-year truce with Saladin. And just the following year, Baldwin V died, and then the trouble began. Jocelyn seized Acre and Beirut for Sybil. Okay, who is Jocelyn? Jocelyn is the brother of Agnes de Courtenay, who has married Hugh de Ebeline, and she had been the former wife of Amaury. Okay. Jocelyn seized Acre and Beirut for Sybil, and Guy and Sybil occupied Jerusalem. Raymond summoned the barons to join him at Tiberias and formally assembled the high court at Neapolis or Nablus. The great majority of barons, especially the Ibelines, attended. Guy and Sybil were joined by Renaud de Chatillon, the Grand Master of the Templars and the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, and the Patriarch Heraclius. Jocelyn sent assurances of support from Acre. 2 crowns were prepared. The Patriarch placed one crown on the head of Sybil, the other on the altar of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Patriarch told Sybil to crown king whomever she wished. She placed the crown on the head of her husband, Guy. Sybil then was proclaimed as the legitimate heiress, as the daughter of Amaury and the sister of Baldwin IV. Okay, here is the seal of the Master of the Temple. And here is the seal of Hugh de Revel, Grand Master of the Hospitallers. Okay. Raymond, the Ibelines, and the High Court assembled at Neapolis and chose the rivals to the throne. This would be Isabel, the younger half-sister of Sybil, and her husband Humphrey de Toron. Though Amaury had been forced to divorce their mother Agnes de Courtenay, the daughters were recognized as legitimate. It was Guy the barons objected to, not Sybil. Okay, somebody mentioned all the daughters that were the daughters who were okay, here's Sybil and here's Isabel. All the women, the question about the women, and now you're getting some of that information about why these women are so important. So here is Sybil, who has now been crowned queen, and here is Isabel, her sister by another marriage, Amaury and Marie. Okay. Isabel Plantagenet was the daughter of Amaury by his second wife, Marie of Byzantium. After Amaury's death, Marie had married Balian of de Ibeline. Okay, did I get that here? Yes. Wait a minute. Did I get that on here? No, here is Marie. Maybe I haven't got it on right. Okay. No, I didn't have it on there. Okay. But Isabel's husband, Humphrey IV de Toron, was one of Guy's most ardent supporters. Humphrey fled by night from Neapolis to Jerusalem and threw himself on the mercy of Guy and Sybil and performed homage to them. The barons now asked Raymond to release them from their homage to him, and he did so, and the barons then hastened to Jerusalem to do homage to Guy and Sybil, except for Ibeline, who refused to kneel, and he went to Antioch. 1187 to 1190 saw the crumbling of the kingdom against the assaults of Saladin and the imprisonment and ransom of the king and many chief barons. This would be King Guy, who was captured and imprisoned along with many chief barons by Saladin. When cooperation was needed, all disintegrated into petty rivalries. In July 1187, Conrad de Montferrat arrived from France just in time to rally and save Tyre alone from the Muslim onslaught. Sidon and Beirut had fallen. Jerusalem was organizing its defenses under Balian de Ibeline, who had married Marie. Okay, I've lost where Marie is. She was the first wife of Amaury. So, the second wife of Amaury. So here, she married an Ibeline. This is where that fits in. Okay, she married Balian de Ibeline.
It's Humphrey or Henry IV that Isabel was married to?
Isabel. I think it's Henry the Fourth de Toron. Okay, maybe it's Humphrey. I might have gotten that wrong. Okay. I can't find it.
Not on
On the genealogy chart, it says she's married to Henry of Tyrone, but in the notes that you've given,
it said Humphrey. I think
Humphrey.
Humphrey is right. Thank you for saying that. I think Humphrey is right. Yeah. Okay, I must have absent-mindedly typed Henry there. Okay. Okay. When cooperation was needed, all disintegrated into petty rivalries. On July 1187, Conrad de Montferrat arrived from France just in time to rally and save Tyre alone from the Muslim onslaught. Sidon and Beirut had fallen, and Jerusalem was organizing its defense against Balian Dibeline, the husband of Marie. Okay, Guy was in prison, and Raymond had retired to Tripoli. Conrad successfully led the defense of Tyre for 2 years. In 1188, Guy and many others were released by Saladin in exchange for oaths not to take arms against him. Okay, but the Patriarch of Jerusalem promptly absolved them from such an unchristian oath, and so they were allowed to take arms against Saladin and break their oath to Saladin, and they at once began to collect forces to regain their lost possessions. In 1189, Guy demanded that Conrad surrender Tyre to him, and Conrad refused. Guy then moved south and besieged Acre. The Third Crusade arrived, and in 1190, during the siege of Acre, Queen Sybil died. Guy was not king anymore. When his wife died, he was not king anymore, and the inheritance then passed to Isabel. Okay, and so we have Sybil here has died. Now the inheritance passes to Isabel. Now look at that lineup. Poor Isabel. She was, I don't know how old she was when she married her first husband, but when her fourth husband died, she was only 24. I mean, she went through these husbands like you wouldn't believe. And here is a penny issued by Guy de Lusignan, who has been struggling all this time to be king, but this is a coin he issued while he was king. And now his wife died and he's not king anymore. But Conrad judged her husband Humphrey unfit to be king. This is Isabel's husband Humphrey, and thanks for pointing that out to me. Conrad persuaded the Patriarch and the Bishop of Beauvais, who had come on crusade along with some of the others from Europe, to divorce them. He received encouragement from many barons, including Marie of Byzantium and her husband Balian de Ibelin. The Archbishop of Canterbury opposed the divorce and the marriage, and he excommunicated Conrad, who had not divorced his last 2 wives. The Bishop of Beauvais annulled the marriage and married Isabel to Conrad. Okay, so we see an interesting struggle. So Conrad here, who had not divorced his last 2 wives, now marries Isabel and becomes a trigamist, I guess you call him. Okay. But Guy de Lusignan did not consider the throne to have passed to Isabel. Guy de Lusignan considered, that he had inherited the throne, and he continued to call himself king. The arrival of the armies of France and England under Philip Augustus and Richard Lionheart then got mixed up in all of this too. So the 2 kings of France and England got all involved in it. Philip championed the cause of Conrad, and Richard Lionheart favored Guy. So now we're going to have the kings of Europe involved in this struggle. On 28 July 1191, a meeting was held, presided over by King Philip and King Richard, and they agreed that Guy should be king until he died, and then Conrad was to succeed. Philip Augustus now left to go home. Philip didn't do very much on that crusade, as we'll see. Richard Lionheart remained in command of the crusading forces, but trouble soon broke out between Conrad and Richard. Conrad refused to assist in Richard's campaign. Here is Philippe Auguste, Philip Augustus, King of France, who didn't spend very long in the Holy Land, and Richard Lionheart. Here's Richard Coeur de Lion, who was a very great crusading hero against Saladin. We'll discuss him later when we discuss the Third Crusade. Richard fought up and down Palestine for 8 months and finally made an advantageous peace with Saladin. The Christians were to keep Jaffa, Ascalon, and the northern towns that they had recaptured and were permitted to visit Jerusalem and the holy places. In April 1192, at Ascalon, the kingship was brought up again at the assembly of the army. Philip Augustus's departure had left Richard Lionheart with practical control of the kingdom, but Conrad and the French knights left behind did not accept his leadership and had withdrawn, leaving Richard to fight alone. With Richard Lionheart preparing to go home, the barons all petitioned Richard to order a single king, and they wanted Conrad. Okay, here is the money of Philip Augustus, who then had gone home. This says Philip, King of France. Okay. Richard acquiesced and sent Henry, Count of Champagne, to Tyre to notify Conrad. On 28 April, the day after Henry's arrival, Conrad was murdered by the assassins, and this was just the assassins were murdering people, and nobody necessarily paid them. I mean, that's what assassins do. Okay, Guy had meanwhile begun negotiations for the purchase of the island of Cyprus from Richard Lionheart, because Richard had landed at Cyprus on his way to the Holy Land and had actually seized it from its Byzantine ruler. So now Cyprus was another Crusader state. Guy left to take over the kingdom in May 1192, and now, instead of having two kings, Jerusalem had no king, but it didn't have the city of Jerusalem anyway, so the kingdom was just about gone. Yeah, question.
When did Jerusalem fall?
It fell to Saladin when Saladin took Guy prisoner, and the rest of the nobles of Jerusalem. That's when Jerusalem fell to Saladin. Okay, Richard then arranged for his nephew Henry of Champagne, who was also a nephew of Philip Augustus, to marry Isabel and be chosen king of Jerusalem. Okay, here is Isabel. Now she's going to marry her third husband, Henry, Count of Champagne, who had come from France, and Henry, Count of Champagne, is going to become king of Jerusalem. Okay. The marriage took place almost immediately after Conrad's death. Although Henry ruled for 5 years, from 1192 to 1197, he was never crowned. In September 1197, Henry fell from a tower window fatally, and apparently he just fell from the window and he was killed, and Isabel was once more a widow at the age of 24. So she ran through a lot of husbands. The High Court met once more to get her another husband, and the selection fell on Amaury de Lusignan, elder brother of Guy, now king of Cyprus. Guy had died in 1194. Amaury was now king of Cyprus, and now Isabel was finally crowned queen, and Amaury de Lusignan was crowned king. Okay, Amaury, and notice I have italicized the kings and the queens. Amaury de Lusignan, but now they're king not only of Jerusalem, but also of Cyprus. The only thing is, Jerusalem practically doesn't exist anymore. Most of it's been conquered by Saladin. And here, if you see, I've tried to show you on this map what it has been reduced to. This green strip here And it's really even narrower than I'm showing you on this map, but that was all the Crusaders controlled. That was the kingdom of Jerusalem. All the rest of it had been conquered by Saladin. Saladin had died, however, in 1193, leaving his empire divided among several heirs. The so-called Kingdom of Jerusalem, which didn't really exist anymore, now had time to recuperate. And the king commissioned Ralph of Tiberias to compile the Code of Laws, which all the laws of the kingdoms were composed, the Livre au Roi. Amaury's reign was also the first in which Jerusalem and Cyprus were ruled together, and this was a great legal achievement, the law codes that were compiled from the kingdom. I mean, they were very advanced in the writing and codifying of laws. However, the kingdom didn't last. That's what the trouble was. In 1204, Amaury died, and Isabel died shortly thereafter. Their son had died shortly before, and now the throne passed to the little princess Marie, Isabel's daughter by Conrad. John de Ibelin, Lord of Beirut, was appointed regent. So now here is Conrad's daughter Marie becomes the queen, and okay, we're going to see her marriage. Okay, John de Ibelin, Lord of Beirut, was appointed regent. Okay, in Cyprus, Amaury was succeeded by Hugh, his son, by Escheve de Ibelin, under the regency of Walter de Montbéliard, husband of Hugh's sister Burgoyne. You don't need to remember any of those names, but remember that Amaury was succeeded by somebody else. An embassy was sent to Philip Augustus to choose a husband for Marie, and he sent John de Brienne. Okay, Philip Augustus chose John de Brienne, a 60-year-old baron, to be the husband of Marie, who was 17 years old. Now, we're going to see a lot of John de Brienne. He's really an amazing character here. In September 1210, John de Brienne landed in Acre, and in October, the marriage took place. One of the most outstanding features of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was inheritance through the female line. As we can see, all this inheritance is going through the female line. The arranged marriage of the 60-year-old John of Brienne and 17-year-old Marie la Marquise ended in tragedy. Marie died just 2 years later, 1212, in childbirth, giving birth to another daughter, another Isabel. But John remained regent for Isabel, but styled himself 10th King of Jerusalem. The chief event of John's reign was the Fifth Crusade, 1219 to 1221, in which Jerusalemite, Antiochene, and Cypriot forces served with the Fifth Crusaders. Under the leadership of King Andrew II of Hungary, Archbishop Leopold II of Austria, and the Earls of Chester and Salisbury from England. And here is a coin issued by John of Brienne. This is the French for John of Brienne. And here's a coin he issued with a very classical portrait of himself on it. Okay. They captured Damietta at the mouth of the Nile at first. This was the Fifth Crusade that captured Damietta, and I think I have a picture of the fall of Damietta. Okay, this is the taking of Damietta. Okay, as they attacked Damietta. Damietta is a city in the Nile Delta, just of Egypt. Okay, they captured Damietta at the mouth of the Nile at first, but the failure to cooperate among the leaders and the stubbornness of the papal legate led them to fail utterly and then lose Damietta. John de Brienne returned to his kingdom and in 1223, now aged 73, set out for the west in search of a husband for his daughter Isabel. He left Eudes de Montbéliard Bailly in his absence. The match that John de Brienne made was a brilliant one. Frederick II, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and King of Sicily, the most brilliant figure in Europe. Okay, here is the seal of Frederick II, Frederick II, and here is a coin issued in his name with one of the magnificent churches that he built. Here is the kingdom that he ruled. All of Germany, his father, he inherited Germany from his father, all of Italy and Sicily, which he inherited from his mother, with the papal states in between. But this is the empire, and he is called the emperor. He is the emperor. He was a protege of Pope Honorius III, with victories at his back and troubles with the Lombard cities and his rebellious son still in the future. Frederick seemed to John and the Pope ideally suited to assume the leadership of the crusading movement dear to them both. But John de Brienne made a fatal error in trusting the marriage negotiations to Hermann von Salza, who, as you recall, was the head of the Hospitallers. Okay. Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, not the Hospitallers. Von Salza was more interested in Frederick than in John, and did not carry out John's instructions that the marriage was to be so arranged that John would retain the throne of Jerusalem for life. Frederick and Isabel were to succeed only after he died, but John's instructions were not carried out. Here is a portrait of Pope Honorius III. Okay. Trusting von Salza, John de Brienne left Italy for France to attend the funeral of Philip Augustus. John assisted at the coronation of Louis VIII in Paris on August 6, 1223, and from France he went on to Santiago on pilgrimage, and he stayed in Spain to marry Berengaria of Castile. Now remember, how old is he? 73? Marrying again. He returned to Italy the following year. The Bishop of Patti in Italy went to Syria as proxy for the emperor in the marriage ceremony between the Princess Isabel and Frederick. And Isabel was now Queen of Jerusalem, and she received the homages of the liegemen of the kingdom. Okay, here is Louis VIII, the new king of France. This is his seal. Isabel now sailed for Brindisi in Italy to marry Frederick in person. She was now crowned Empress of the Holy Roman Empire and Queen of Sicily on 9 November 1228. But now John of Brienne, now age 75, discovered that he was no longer king. Frederick at once demanded from him seisin of the kingdom and from the Syrian barons who had escorted the queen from Tyre and the homages due him as king. He confirmed Eudes de Montbéliard in the bailliage until he should come in person to Syria. So Frederick was taking a very active role now as king of Jerusalem. And John de Brienne had no recourse but to stir up trouble for Frederick with the Pope. Pope Honorius III had been urging the emperor to fulfill a vow of homage taken in 1215. Honorius was inclined to blame Frederick for the failure of the Fifth Crusade because the armies had waited for him to arrive and had been weakened by the delay. But Frederick could not depart at once. They agreed that he would leave in 2 years, in 1227. Thus, in 1227, the emperor prepared an army and dispatched Thomas de Aquina, and this is not Thomas Aquinas, this is a different Thomas de Aquina. He dispatched Thomas de Aquina to Syria with an advanced guard and appointed him Bailli of Jerusalem. But Frederick was suddenly taken ill and unable to set sail. He applied to Pope Gregory IX, who was Honorius' successor, Honorius now having died, for another postponement. The postponement was annoying because Frederick had negotiated a treaty with Melik el-Kamil, the Sultan of Egypt. In return for assistance to be given Egypt against Damascus, the Emperor Frederick was to receive the city of Jerusalem from the Sultan Melik. So he got Jerusalem back by a treaty, but not by a battle. Gregory IX, ignorant of that treaty, thought the postponement was another attempt of Frederick to avoid the crusade and excommunicated Frederick. Undaunted, the emperor, recovered from illness, sailed for Syria on the 28th of June, 1228, with a large army, probably the only excommunicated king ever to go on crusade. And this is Gregory IX, who had, of course, excommunicated Frederick. All right. But it was not as king of Jerusalem that Frederick sailed. Isabel had given birth to a son, Conrad, and died in the process. When the news of Isabel's death was received in Acre, the liegemen met in the high court and elected John de Ibelin of Beirut and Balian of Sidon as bailies for Conrad, pending the arrival of Frederick. Ibelin declined, and Hugh de Montbéliard was returned to the bailliage. In July 1228, Frederick reached Cyprus. He landed at Limassol and established himself in the palace of Philip de Ibelin, vacant since Philip's death the previous year. He was met by Thomas of Acera and Richard Phalanger, his marshal of the empire and Balian of Sidon, John de Ibelin, and the Cypriot barons. Frederick demanded and received the homage of the 11-year-old King Henry of Cyprus, over whom he claimed suzerainty on the grounds that Frederick's father, Henry VI, had awarded the royal crown to Amaury in return for vassalage. But Henry had already been crowned in 1225 by his uncles, Philip and John de Ibelin, who feared Frederick would claim the regency. Meanwhile, Philip de Ibelin had been serving as regent. When Frederick demanded custody of Henry, Ibelin agreed, but did not recognize Frederick as baillie. From 1228 to 1224, the Lombard War dominated the history of the Latin states. Frederick and his agents and partisans on the one hand fought the Ibelline factions on the others. They fought out the control of the kingdom. The Ibellines maintained the constitutional rights of the feudal baronage against the imperialists, and they regarded, of course, Frederick as an imperialist. The Ibellines established in Jerusalem and Cyprus the rule of law illustrated by the assizes. Okay. Trouble started in July 1228 when Frederick demanded that John of Beirut render an account of his bailliage since the death of Hugh, and that he surrender Beirut to the emperor as a fortress of Conrad's kingdom directly in the hands of the regent. This demand took place at an imperial banquet in the palace at Limassol in Cyprus, in the presence of the assembled Outremer baronage. Okay, Outremer baronage would have been all of the baronage from Jerusalem. Outremer means across the sea in the Holy Land. John of Beirut, and all of them were in Cyprus at this time. John of Beirut at first thought it was a joke, but Frederick was in earnest. John replied that he held Beirut as a fief granted by Amaury and Isabel, and would prove it in the high court of Jerusalem, and that he had never profited from the bailliage of Cyprus, and would prove it in the high court of Cyprus. With this, the emperor had to be satisfied. John was to give 2 of his sons as hostages that he would appear, and 20 barons were to pledge their persons and goods as further security. Okay, here is just to remind you where Cyprus is, an island here, and Outremer is here, very little of which remains in control of the Crusaders at this time. Frederick received the hostages and imprisoned them in chains. John of Beirut fled to Nicosia. Okay, let's go back to that map a minute. Nicosia is up here. No, not up there. Okay, Nicosia. Not on this map. Okay. I was thinking it was there, but I think Nicosia is right here. Right about there. All right. Frederick recalled the troops from Syria and moved on Nicosia. John retreated to the strong fortress of St. Hilarion in the mountains, and just then Frederick received news that the Pope and John de Brienne were ravaging his lands in Italy. I didn't add up John de Brienne's age there, but he's about 80 when he's leading the army to attack the forces of the emperor in Italy. Frederick, of course, was anxious to get to Syria and get on with the crusade so that he could return to Italy. He consented to a truce whereby Ibelin surrendered St. Hilarion to King Henry of Cyprus and took an oath of fealty to Frederick as suzerain of the King of Cyprus. That means overlord of the King of Cyprus. Ibelin still refused to recognize Frederick as Bailey, and both parties promised to accept the decision of the High Court. Frederick went to Acre in September, accompanied by Ibelin and the baronage. The imperialist garrisons were left to guard the chief fortresses of the island. At Acre, the barons recognized Frederick as regent for Conrad. The bailliage of the kingdom was surrendered to Frederick, but the excommunication raised opposition of the clergy and the military orders. The Templars and Hospitallers refused to recognize him or answer to him because he had been excommunicated, but the Teutonic Knights disregarded the papal ban and allied themselves with Frederick. Yeah.
But then to go back to Urban II saying that those that went on a crusade would have the excommunications, etc., lifted.
Right. So they had the choice. I mean, it was fuzzy. They could choose either law that they wanted to follow, but they did it for partisan reasons. I mean, this is pure politics. All of this stuff that's going on. So Frederick turned around and played politics. What he did was declare a war of Christ, a crusade in the Holy Land by which the orders could join him, as it did not involve his own authority. So that's how he got around it. Okay, now all the orders could join his army, and he took his army to Jaffa. There was little fighting. Neither the emperor nor the Sultan Al-Kamel had any desire for war. Frederick's chief desire was to get back to Italy, and Al-Kamel was anxious to consolidate the conquests he had just made from Damascus. Consequently, they again signed a treaty which renewed in general the terms of the old friendship. Frederick was given official control over Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, Jaffa, Toron, Caesarea, and Montfort. And from Jaffa, Frederick then went to Jerusalem, where he assumed the crown of Jerusalem. So, for a second time, he got Jerusalem back by a treaty. Here is Jaffa, so we can see the city of Jaffa that he got back. Okay. He crowned himself because, quote, no clergy were present. And that was because the Patriarch Gerald had placed the city under interdict. But nevertheless, the kings of Italy and Sicily, who he was descended from through his mother, had for 300 years crowned themselves king, and claiming that Christ crowned them king, and that the Pope or an archbishop did not have the right to crown them king. So I would suspect his motives, I mean, he did it. He could have waited for the Patriarch to come back, but he didn't. He crowned himself. He then appointed bailees to represent him in Jerusalem and Cyprus. In Jerusalem, the bailees were Balion of Sidon and Eudes de Montbéliard in the presence of the High Court at Acre. He then sold the bailliage of Cyprus for 3 years to 5 barons who were all enemies of the Ibelines. The 5 barons swore to drive the Ibelines out of Cyprus forever. On the 1st of May, 1229, leaving a small garrison in the city under the command of Eudes de Montbéliard, Frederick returned to Acre and then set sail for Italy. At once Alice of Cyprus appeared before the High Court demanding the throne of Jerusalem as the most legal heir of King Amaury, because Conrad had not come to claim it in person. But the barons informed her they were lieges of Frederick, who held Jerusalem for Conrad. But they sent an embassy to Conrad to ask that he come to Acre within a year to receive the homages of his liegemen. Frederick returned to Italy to find the papal armies, led by John de Brienne, now age 80, ravaging his kingdom, and his control throughout Italy seriously menaced. Frederick's campaign drove the papal armies back to the papal states and forced the Pope to sign the Treaty of San Germano in 1230. Then he turned to remodeling the constitution of his Sicilian kingdom. and he neglected Germany and Jerusalem for the time being. In summer 1231, Frederick sent a fleet under Richard Philanger to the east. Ibelline, now in charge, prepared to defend Cyprus, and the imperialists were unable to land. The ambassadors from the emperor were sent to Henry of Cyprus, demanding the expulsion of the Ibellines. Henry replied that he would not and could not comply. Philanger then occupied Tyre and began to besiege Beirut. Ibelline at once demanded assistance from Henry, and the Cypriots prepared to relieve Beirut. The barons started to desert to the emperor as legitimate bailli. Philanger, after securing Tyre and investing Beirut, went to Acre, and there he summoned the high court. He presented Frederick's letters appointing Philanger bailli. The appointment was accepted by the barons. The high court assembled, and the seizure of Beirut was protested. The rule was that no one could be disseized except by the judgment of the high court. Philanger had disseized Ibelline without a trial, and the high court demanded that Beirut be returned to Ibelline. Philanger replied that the emperor had ordered him to seize Beirut, and it seemed just to him he was following the emperor's orders. Thus, he refused to recognize the supremacy of the assizes and the law, and he disregarded the assent of the high court and acted in violation of the laws. This threw the moderate party into the Ibelline camp. The kingdom was now divided into two hostile camps. Supporting the imperial claims were the western troops, the Lombards, the Teutonic Knights, and the Pisans, and they held Tyre and Sidon and had invested Beirut. With the Ibellines were the majority of the baronage of Jerusalem and Cyprus, 43 important lords, the commune of Acre, the king of Cyprus, and the Genoese, and their centers were Cyprus, Acre, and Beirut. And if I can find my map, we can look at that. Okay, I put it in, there it is. Okay, so we have Cyprus, Acre, and Beirut. Cyprus, okay, where's Acre? Beirut, and Acre is right up here, I think. So we've got to sort of try, oh, here's Acre. Cyprus, Acre, and Beirut, a triangle of power here, and Tyre and Sidon was the center of the other two. Okay, they're actually up here. Okay. Between the two parties were the clergy, headed by the Patriarch and Peter, Archbishop of Caesarea, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Venetians, Bohemond of Antioch, and a few lords. Pope Gregory IX urged mediation and wrote to the rebels asking that they submit to Frederick. The neutral group tried to keep the peace but was unable to prevent hostilities. Okay, question?
Was Frederick still excommunicated at this point?
I think that his excommunication was lifted as a result of the battle with the Pope when he was fighting in Italy. The Pope then lifted his excommunication. Good question, yeah.
And the Bohemond of Antioch, this is not the same Bohemond that that was over in the Holy Land in the first place, right?
Oh no. This would be here is Bohemond III. Okay, of Antioch on our little chart. All right, no, that would make him live 200 years.
Yes.
He wasn't that successful.
John de Brienne.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, John de Brienne lived longer than anybody. Okay, the battle was joined and went against the imperialists who sought help from Armenia, Tripoli, and Italy. In 1233, the King Henry of Cyprus reached his majority, but Philander's bailliage had been a disaster. He had alienated everyone, and it was actually Philander's incompetence that had caused this war. Philip then sent the bishop of Sidon with letters replacing Phalanger with Philip de Mogastel. The barons refused to accept him. The high court proclaimed Balian of Sidon and Eudes de Montbéliard rightful bailees, and the mob of Acre broke up the meeting with considerable violence. Okay, what's happening here? What's happening? Think about all of these events. Frederick gave up his attempt to control Cyprus, and John de Ibelin was now the strongest in both Cyprus and Syria and prepared to attack Tyre, Frederick's last stronghold. Pope Gregory IX now intervened because he had been reconciled with Frederick after the battle with John de Brienne. The Pope now proposed a wholly unacceptable imperial settlement, divesting constitutional rights from the High Court, actually taking away all the rights of the High Court and giving the rights to the emperor. At this point, John de Ibelin died. Now, Thibaut of Champagne, King of Navarre, and Richard, Earl of Cornwall, arrived with 2 bands of crusaders, and they stayed at Acre. With them was Ralph of Soissons and Alice of Cyprus, now married Ralph of Soissons. She suddenly became a most important pawn in the game of politics. On 25 April 1243, Conrad would attain his majority. The Ibelines awaited this date to throw off their fealty to Phalanger, still attempting to abide by the laws. As soon as Conrad came of age, he sent messengers to the High Court, and the High Court was joined by the Genoese, the Venetians, the Templars, and the city of Acre. Ralph of Soissons presented the claims of his wife Alice as heir of King Amaury II. Okay, here we have Marie Alice here, who is the sister of Marie and the daughter of this Amaury right here. Okay, she is the daughter of Amaury and Isabel. And she married Raymond of Soissons, and now she's making a claim to the throne. Okay? She was recognized as heir after Conrad. Should Conrad not come in person to claim the throne, she would be the heir. Conrad's coming of age ended the regency of Frederick, and Conrad's failure to appear in person opened the throne to the next heir. Conrad continued to be titular king, but the powers of the kingship were given over to Alice and her heirs, who assumed the title not of queen and king, but seigneurs of Jerusalem, sort of like seniors, like lords of Jerusalem and the Sicine of the kingdom. This ambiguous position of Alice was most convenient for the barons who claimed the High Court had control of all the cities during this regency. They now set about driving the imperialists out of the east, and they succeeded. But what had happened was they had lost all the lands in Jerusalem. 1291 was when the very last Crusaders were driven from the Holy Land. And the kingdom of Jerusalem, having lost most of its land, disintegrated in a paroxysm of the competing claims of democracy and imperialism, and now had lost even its crowned monarchs to the democratic ambitions of the High Court and its peers of the realm, the barons. So, I started out by saying this was a democracy. Do you agree or disagree? Now,
within the limitations of what was considered democratic back in that day, then I would tend to agree.
Okay, it's a democracy in the same sense that Greece was, that the aristocrats formed the democracy. What do you think?
It seems hard to call it a democracy when the line of succession is a family line.
But in every case, the High Court determined who was going to succeed. And isn't it interesting that they picked the line through the women? Do you think that's a sign of weakness or strength of the royal line, that they chose the line descending through the women?
I think it was a choice based on necessity.
Yeah, it could be that. But also, you know, it helped the High Court choose who was going to be king, because they could have the queen there, that the inheritance could go through the women, and in many cases the High Court chose her husband, and so that meant it's like a kind of election, and the marriage is a side issue. They're sort of electing who's going to be king, and then they marry him to the queen, and that's how he gets to be king.
Which would point towards a sign of strength for the High Court,
Yes,
for
it
the
would.
democratic process.
It would, yeah. If you call it a kind of limited democracy, what do you think?
Well, I think that if you look at Sybil, they picked Baldwin IV, her brother, before they appointed her as the. So, in the other
Right.
instances, were there any brothers available, or was it just the daughters were the only ones?
There were only daughters. There were only daughters.
That's
But-
why they went through the women's line.
Yeah, but you know, in Europe, the rule was made that you couldn't inherit through the female line, and so it's really, really different here in the Holy Land, that you could inherit through the female line.
Right. I mean, it would have been made things a little bit even more complicated, but it would have been as legit if they were doing it in more the European tradition, to go find some distant cousin or uncle or something like that
Yeah.
to replace. Could have gotten Raymond II, Raymond III, Bohemond III. That whole host of other people.
They had plenty of cousins to choose from. Yeah. But they chose to go through the female line, and that's very interesting. That's very interesting. But of course, Melisande was a remarkable queen. She was a wonderful queen. She handled things very well, and her son was quite able too. So we had quite a number of able kings and queens. Melisande has been picked out by a lot of women's historians to look at as an interesting and powerful queen. To be compared to someone like Adela of Blois and the Empress Matilda in England. And we'll run up into some other powerful women like Blanche of Castile, the mother of St. Louis, who was also involved in Crusades. Okay, we have 56 seconds. By some miracle, I actually got through everything in our notes, so that's quite amazing. So we'll see you all for the midterm before we meet again for lectures next week. Okay.